incomplete altar. I never believed in the supernatural. Not ghosts, not spirits, not anything that couldn't be measured, quantified, or explained by science. That was before. This is a true story that fundamentally changed everything I thought I knew about our world. I've never shared this publicly before, but I feel compelled to now, as a warning, never set up an altar without photos. Once you hear what happened to me, you won't either. My name is Alejandro Reyes. I'm 33 years old, a systems engineer for a software company in Mexico City. 5 years ago, if you'd asked me about paranormal phenomena, I would have laughed and told you there's always a rational explanation. A draft causing a door to close, the house settling your mind, playing tricks in the dark. I was that guy. If you're not like that yourself, you definitely know someone who is. But what happened in my apartment during DíaDeLosMuertos changed everything. And I swear on everything I hold dear that every word I'm about to tell you is true. I was renting this beautiful old apartment in the historic center of Mexico City. It was in one of those classic buildings that used to be a single enormous house, the kind with a central courtyard from colonial times. Over the decades, they'd split it into smaller and smaller rooms until each person had their own mini apartment. Wooden floors that creaked with every step, heavy ornate doors that took effort to push open, high ceilings that disappeared into shadow, large windows overlooking the street letting in both light and the constant urban symphony of the Centro Histórico district. It was a beautiful place, truly, but also incredibly noisy and old. At night, every sound was amplified. I ended up there because it was cheap at the time. I basically took it as an emergency solution when I found myself without both a roommate and a steady job simultaneously, and I stayed. During the pandemic, most tenants had left and rent was half price, so I seized the opportunity and grew accustomed to the buses passing by the sound of heels, when the upstairs neighbors walked around, even the arguments of the couple in apartment 2B who screamed nightly about breaking up, but never did. I want to make this clear because it's important to everything I'm about to tell you. I spent my first Day of the Dead alone that year. I had never experienced one like that before. I always celebrated with my mother since my father passed when I was 16. From that point on, it was almost obligatory, not the kind of obligation where your mother gets angry if you don't show up, but an emotional obligation. It was what we did as a family. My mother would buy pan de muerto brew coffee, hang papel picado light candles, and most importantly, display the photographs. My father in a frame, grandparents on each side, and even an uncle I never met, but as my mother would say, we remember him too. But that year was the pandemic, you know how it was. My mother was high risk, and we were still in that moment when everyone was traumatized, when nobody wanted to enter anyone else's home, when everything was wiped down with alcohol disinfected, when leaving food at the door was as close as a visit got. So I told her I'd better not go, that I'd video call instead. As I said, it was my first Day of the Dead alone. I wasn't even thinking about setting up an altar or anything. For me, honestly, it was just another Monday. But as evening fell, I started feeling strange, not exactly sad, but empty. I suppose anyone who's spent their first significant holiday alone will understand me. That kind of silence you don't like. Well, I thought I'll put something up, even if just symbolic. I didn't think much about it. It wasn't some act of tradition or respect. It was almost automatic, like when you do something because you've seen it all your life and now you're repeating it. I took the only low table I had in the living room, pushed it against the wall, laid down a clean napkin as a tablecloth, and placed a small votive candle I had on it. I went to the kitchen, poured some coffee into a cup, and heated up some leftover quesadillas from the night before. I also grabbed a sweetbread I'd bought that morning and placed everything there. But here comes the crucial part. I didn't put any photos. I had pictures of my father and grandparents, but only on my phone. At the time, honestly, I didn't think it was necessary. I thought, well, they know who they are. As simple and stupid as that. I just thought, this is for you, and that was it. But without truly believing that anyone would actually come visit me. Another thing that might be important is that I also didn't put flowers. I hadn't bought cempasúchil marigolds or anything because I wasn't even planning to make an altar. As I said, it was improvised, without color, without scent, just food, drink, and a small lit candle. That was all. That night I went to bed late because I was working on my computer. I work remotely, and during the pandemic we worked more in the early morning hours than during the day. So I had this horrible schedule of staying up until 2 or 3 a.m., and that night I went to bed around 2:30. I didn't close my bedroom door. I never did. It was one of the luxuries of living alone. And this is where things get strange. I started dreaming, and initially the dream didn't seem like a nightmare. It was like when you're half asleep but can still hear the street in the distance. In my dream, I could see the living room through the doorway with the large window overlooking the street. And there was something outside the window, not pressed against the glass, but a bit behind, like standing on the sidewalk, looking up at me from below. Something dark. Not dark as in skin color, not dark as when you see a person but only see the silhouette. But there was definitely someone tall, hunched forward, as if bent toward the front. And in my dream I felt that this thing was looking inside, not at me, but at the altar. I know this sounds very specific, but I want to make it clear. It wasn't someone trying to break in to steal. It wasn't a casual shadow. It was something looking at the altar like a child peering at a table at a party to see what food there was. Then in the dream, that thing took a few very slow steps toward the window, but instead of staying there, it was as if somehow it was already inside. The next image in the dream placed it inside the apartment in one step, then crouching before the altar, huddled with its body folded over as if its legs didn't work well, and it was positioned on 4 points, but not completely on all fours, like someone who doesn't know if they're human or animal. That strange posture is what I remember most. And that's when I started hearing something else. I was dreaming, but I heard a real sound, like something wet, something eating, not chewing like a normal person, but like when a dog shoves its face into a plate and all you hear is this desperate hack, hack, hack sound, that frantic noise of not breathing, just swallowing that sound. And then I woke up. I didn't open my eyes immediately. It was like when you wake up and still don't know where you are. But I kept hearing that sound, and at that moment my brain made the connection. That sound wasn't in my dream. It had infiltrated my dream. That sound was in my living room. I remained lying still for a few seconds. I could hear it clearly. It was someone swallowing, not eating normally, but swallowing as if they were very hungry, as if they hadn't eaten for days and someone had left them a plate on the floor. The first thing I thought, and this is perfectly logical, in an old building in the city center, was someone has broken in. And I got angry. I wasn't scared. I was angry because I thought it was someone from the same building who had broken in to steal food or whatever. Plus, with the pandemic, we were all carrying the fear that anyone could be infected, and I didn't even want to approach a stranger. My room was almost dark, with just a bit of orange light from the street coming through the hallway window, that light from the old street lamps outside. I didn't turn on the bedroom light because I thought, if I turn it on, I'll startle whoever it is. They'll run and they might jump at me. And I'm not a fighter. I wasn't going to get into a confrontation with anyone at 3 a.m. What did I do? I slowly got up and walked toward the bedroom door. And here I did feel fear. Not ghost fear, but physical fear, because when I grabbed the doorknob, I felt my hand trembling. I thought, if someone is there, what if they have something, a knife, a razor? What am I going to do? But I was already there, and the sound continued swallowing like an animal. I opened my bedroom door very slightly, just enough to stick half my body out, and I stayed there still inside my room, not stepping into the hallway. I didn't turn on any lights. I just let the light from outside come in through the large window in the living room, and I saw it. I know what I saw. It was in front of the altar, in front of my improvised altar, which wasn't even an altar or anything, and it was hunched over as if shrinking into itself, with its back almost humped, its legs bent strangely, almost backward, as if it didn't know how to position itself properly. It had its hands on the low table and was shoving food into its mouth. not grabbing with fingers and bringing to its mouth, but pushing it in as if smearing the quesadillas on its face. And I say face, but the truth is I can't say that what I saw had a normal face. I saw the shape of its head. I saw one ear hanging slightly in the skin. This I do remember. The skin didn't look right, like loose flaps, like flesh that wasn't well attached anymore, like when you see boiled chicken and it starts to separate into fibers. I'm sorry for the image, but it's the only comparable thing. You could clearly hear it breathing through its mouth like a sick person. A labored breathing with a wheeze, and occasionally it made a small noise like a grunt of discomfort, not of threat, more like desperation. I froze in place. Now I was truly afraid, deeply afraid, because this wasn't a normal person, and it wasn't an animal either. There was no way it could be. It was literally sitting at the table with its hands on it, with an almost human posture. That's what scared me most, the almost human posture. And then, without me making any noise, that thing stopped eating. It became still, as if it had realized I was watching it, and very, very slowly it raised its head. I don't know how to explain it. The eyes had no shine. They didn't seem like normal eyes with pupils and reflection. They were completely white, like milk, like cataracts, but wide open, looking directly at me for a moment. At that point I did make a sound, a small gasp that escaped me, but it echoed throughout the apartment. As soon as the sound was heard, it stood up abruptly, but not in a normal way. Not like when you stand up pushing with hands on knees to gain strength. No, it was like a jerk, as if its body had no weight and it moved. And when I say it moved, I don't mean it ran toward me. It moved toward the hallway leading to the kitchen as if it knew exactly where the exit to the apartment was, but at the same time it seemed unable to walk properly. It went sideways as if dragging a foot, as if something was hanging from it. I instinctively backed away, closed my bedroom door, and this time I locked it. And now the paralyzing terror hit me because I thought, that thing is in my home. It's going to try to get into my room. That's when I grabbed my phone and first called the building manager. I didn't call 911. I called the old lady who lives on the first floor, who collects our rent and all that. Her name was Doña Carmela, and I was so scared that I called her. I called her at 3:08 a.m. to ask her to come up. Imagine calling an old lady to protect you. She took a while to answer, obviously, but I said, "There's someone inside, there's someone here, please come up with your husband." And I swear to you, I had never been so close to crying as I was at that moment, because I kept hearing the noises. But now they weren't the sounds of something eating, but small tapping noises in the kitchen, as if something was touching the walls, looking for a way out. Within 2 minutes, I heard footsteps in the building hallway and knocks on my door, but normal human knocks. They asked me to open up, and I ran to do so. Doña Carmela and her husband entered with a large, old-fashioned flashlight and an even older revolver. The neighbor next door also came out. At that time he was an elderly man who barely slept, always awake smoking on the balcony. All three entered the living room with me, and here's what everyone always asks when I tell this story. What did they find? Nothing. We found nothing. We turned on all the lights, checked the living room, kitchen, bathroom. Nothing. And I swear to you, that thing must have gone out through the kitchen because it didn't come toward my bedroom, but the exit door in the hallway was locked from inside, and the windows were closed because it was cold. So according to them, there was no one there. And yes, at that moment, you start to feel a little crazy. You start to imagine that you didn't really see anything, that it was just in your head. I was shaking, my hands were sweating, and the neighbor, the old man, said to me, "Well, what did you see?" And I explained everything to him. Not with as much detail as I'm telling you now, but I did tell them that it looked like a person who was devouring the food from the altar, that the skin looked terrible, that it turned to look at me with white eyes. And when I said that it looked at me with white eyes, Doña Carmela just stared at me. She didn't mock me. Didn't say, "Oh, my child, you're crazy," or anything. She looked at me very seriously, and it was she who asked me, "Did you put photos on the altar?" And I said no. I said that I thought it didn't matter. And she told me something that chilled me to the bone. She said it calmly, as if explaining something that any child should know. Never put food for them if you're not going to put photos. That's not how it's done. If you put food without a photo, without a name, without flowers, you're telling anyone, come. And anyone can come, whoever is closest, whoever still remembers that they want to eat. I thought she was speaking figuratively, another spirit, another departed soul or something, but she continued explaining. There are dead who no longer remember who they were because nobody calls them, nobody puts anything for them, and if you leave them something, they take it like animals, as if someone were going to take it away from them. When she said like animals, my stomach turned because that was exactly how that thing was eating what I had left. Exactly like that. She told me that the altar isn't just for putting food, that the cempasúchil flowers are also to keep away those who aren't yours, to keep them from approaching, and that the photo serves the same purpose, to make your own come. Your own, she said, and that if you don't put a photograph, you leave the door open for anyone passing by. And that phrase, anyone passing by, I'll never forget. We sat there talking in the living room for about an hour with the lights on, and I appreciated it. I was still in shock. Doña Carmela made me coffee in my own coffee maker. Her husband went downstairs and brought up a bunch of dried flowers they had from another altar. They had below cempasúchil flowers already a bit wilted, and she placed them there next to the cup and plate as if that would help that same night. I didn't say anything. I was quiet, just listening. Before leaving, she said to me, "Tomorrow take out that food and clean everything well, and next year, if you're going to do it right. If not, don't do it at all." I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I watched them leave. The apartment suddenly seemed much larger and emptier than before. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every creak of the wooden floors, every distant siren from the city streets made me jump. I sat on my bed with my back against the headboard, the lights on, staring at the bedroom door I'd locked. Morning couldn't come fast enough. The gray light of dawn filtering through my window was the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen. I immediately went to the altar and cleared everything away, scrubbing the table surface thoroughly, as if trying to erase not just the food but the memory of what had happened. As I cleaned, I noticed something I hadn't seen the night before, a series of small, dark stains on the wooden floor leading from where the altar had been to the kitchen. They looked almost like wet footprints, but not quite human-shaped, more elongated, distorted. When I tried to clean them, I found they wouldn't come up completely, as if they had seeped into the wood itself. That afternoon, I called my mother. I didn't tell her about what happened. I knew she'd either worry herself sick or think I was losing my mind. Instead, I just asked detailed questions about how to properly set up an altar for next year. She seemed pleased by my sudden interest in tradition, explaining each element's importance, the levels representing heaven and earth, the path of marigold petals, the water for the thirsty souls, and most importantly, the photographs. Without the photographs, how would they know they're welcome, she said. How would they find their way back to us? I nodded silently on the video call, thinking to myself, and how would others know they're not welcome? That night, despite my exhaustion, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those milky white orbs staring back at me. I felt a presence in my apartment that hadn't been there before, as if by acknowledging it, by seeing it, I had somehow given it permission to stay. The air felt heavier, colder, particularly in the corner where I'd placed the makeshift altar. As I finally drifted into a restless sleep near dawn, a thought occurred to me that would haunt me for days to come. What if it wasn't just passing by? What if it had been here all along in this old building with its long history, just waiting for someone to extend an invitation? I would soon learn that my ignorance of tradition had opened a door that would not be easily closed. And the consequences would be far more terrible than I could have imagined. Sleep deprivation makes the mind do strange things. The morning after my encounter, I tried to convince myself it had been a particularly vivid nightmare, my subconscious conjuring some twisted manifestation of guilt for celebrating Day of the Dead improperly. But those dark stains on the floor wouldn't wash away completely, and the memory of those milky white eyes was too real. 3 days passed without incident. I worked, I ate, I pretended everything was normal. I'd cleaned the altar area thoroughly as Doña Carmela had instructed. But something had changed in my apartment. The silence felt different, expectant, as if the very air was listening. Several times I caught myself staring at the empty space where the altar had been, feeling an inexplicable pull to look there. On the fourth night, exhaustion finally won out over fear, and I fell into a deep sleep. That's when the dreams began. I was standing in my living room, but everything was bathed in a sickly yellow light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The space where my makeshift altar had been glowed brighter than everything else, like a beacon. As I watched, a thick, oily darkness began seeping in through the closed window, forming a pool on the floor. The darkness pulsed as if breathing. Then it began to rise, taking shape not quite human, not quite animal. It formed a hunched figure with impossibly long, thin limbs and that same loose, decaying skin I'd seen before, but this time I could see more details. The flesh hung from its frame like wet clothing on a line, occasionally revealing glimpses of something underneath that wasn't bone or muscle, just emptiness. Its head turned toward me with a jerky, unnatural motion. Those milky white eyes found mine, and a voice that sounded like gravel being crushed filled my head. Requierdame. Remember me. I tried to scream but couldn't. I tried to run, but my feet were rooted to the floor. The figure began moving toward me with that same awkward sideways gait I'd seen before, dragging one leg as if it had forgotten how to walk properly. Requierdame, it repeated louder, this time the voice echoing in my skull. Me olvidaron. They forgot me. As it reached me, it raised a hand with too many joints, fingers too long and bent at impossible angles. The hand reached for my face, and I felt a cold so intense it burned. Just before it touched me, I finally managed to scream and woke up. My bedroom was freezing. The digital thermometer on my nightstand read 52 degrees Fahrenheit, despite it being early November in Mexico City, when temperatures rarely dip below 60 degrees Fahrenheit at night. My breath misted in the air before me. The cold was concentrated in one corner of the room, as if something was absorbing all the heat there. I turned on every light and sat huddled under my blankets until morning, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next day I decided I needed answers. This wasn't just about an improper altar anymore. Something about this building, about my apartment specifically, had attracted whatever I'd encountered. I started with the most obvious source of information, Doña Carmela. I knocked on her door around midday, bringing a bag of freshly baked conchas as a peace offering for disturbing her so early that night. She invited me in without hesitation, as if she'd been expecting me. "You've had more visits," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, explaining about the dream, the cold, the stains that wouldn't clean. She listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as if confirming something she already knew. When I finished, she sighed deeply. "I should have told you more about this building that night. Come sit." She gestured to her kitchen table, already set with 2 cups of coffee. It was as if she had prepared for this conversation. "This building has a difficult past," she began, her voice lowered even though we were alone. "It was built in 1879 for a wealthy family, yes, but what few people know is that during the Mexican Revolution around 1913, it was briefly used as a field hospital." I felt my stomach tighten. "A hospital here," she nodded, "for about 8 months. When the fighting came to this part of the city, they needed somewhere to treat the wounded. The family had fled, so revolutionaries took over the house. Many soldiers died here, some quickly from their wounds, others slowly from infection." "Were they buried here?" I asked, though I already feared the answer. "Not all, but some. Records from that time are incomplete, but there was a registry book found during renovations in the 1960s. Many patients weren't identified. They were brought in unconscious or delirious with fever. Some were buried in the basement when the fighting made it too dangerous to transport bodies to the cemetery. A basement. I'd never explored our building's basement. It was always locked, used mainly for storage, according to Doña Carmela, though most of it remained abandoned. Nameless souls, I whispered, remembering what she'd said about those who no one remembers. Exactly. Her eyes met mine with a knowing look. When no one remembers your name, when no one calls to you on Dia de los Muertos, when no one puts your photo on an altar, after enough time you begin to forget yourself. Forget yourself. The concept chilled me more than the physical cold in my bedroom had. First they forget their names, then their faces. Eventually they even forget how to be human. She took a sip of her coffee. What you saw, Alejandro, was not just any wandering spirit. From your description, it has been forgotten for a very long time. But why my apartment specifically? There must be dozens of improper altars across the city on Day of the Dead. Doña Carmela's expression darkened. Your apartment number 3A was once the main ward of the field hospital. If anyone died unnamed, unremembered, it would have been there. My coffee turned bitter in my mouth. I was living directly above where unnamed soldiers had died in agony a century ago, and I had inadvertently invited them in. "What can I do?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "You've opened a door," she said gently, "and once opened, such doors are not easily closed, but we can try to make it smaller, harder to pass through." She disappeared into another room and returned with a small cloth bag. "Burn these herbs before sunset and at sunrise. Place salt across your doorways and windowsills. And most importantly, acknowledge what you've seen." Acknowledge it, you mean talk to it. Not directly, no. But set up a proper altar. Include a photo of your family as you should have done, but also find an image that might represent those who died here. There must be photographs of revolutionary soldiers somewhere, no. They may not be the exact souls, but the intent matters. Show that you remember them even if you don't know their names. I took the bag of herbs with trembling fingers. Will this make it go away? Doña Carmela's eyes softened with pity. I don't know, mijo. But it might make peace between you. That night I followed her instructions meticulously. I burned the herbs which filled my apartment with a sharp, cleansing scent. I laid salt lines at every threshold, and I began researching the history of the building and the Mexican Revolution. What I discovered was disturbing. Not only had my building been a field hospital, but historical records indicated an incident in November 1913 where approximately 20 unidentified revolutionary soldiers died of gangrene after a particularly bloody battle. With the fighting intensifying, there was no time for proper burial. The bodies were interred in a makeshift mass grave location unspecified in the records, but given what Doña Carmela had told me, almost certainly in the basement of my building. November 1913, exactly 107 years before my Day of the Dead encounter. I couldn't sleep that night or the next. I installed a small security camera in my living room, pointing it at the area where the altar had been. Not because I expected to capture a ghost, I still retained enough scientific skepticism to doubt that would work, but because I needed some objective evidence that I wasn't losing my mind. For 3 nights, nothing appeared on the footage. Just an empty living room, occasional headlights from passing cars casting shadows on the walls. But on the 4th night at exactly 3:04 a.m., the camera caught something. It began as a subtle darkening in one corner of the room, like a shadow deepening despite no change in the external light. Then this darkness seemed to pool and thicken, forming a vaguely vertical shape about the height of a person. It remained stationary for several minutes, then gradually moved toward the former altar location. The movement wasn't the smooth glide often depicted in ghost shows. It was jerky, uneven, like stop-motion animation missing frames. When it reached the wall where my altar had been, it appeared to press against it as if searching for something that should be there. Then, just before the recording ended, it seemed to turn toward the camera. In a single frame, just 1/30th of a second, I could make out what looked like a face within the mass of darkness. Not clearly defined, but unmistakably a face with two pinpoints of light where eyes should be. My blood ran cold as I replayed that frame over and over. This wasn't lens flare or a digital artifact. Something had been in my apartment looking directly at my camera. I immediately called Doña Carmela, who came up with her husband, Vicente. They watched the footage in silence, their faces growing increasingly grave. "This is worse than I thought," Doña Carmela finally said. "It's not just passing through anymore, it's looking for something." "For what?" I asked. She didn't answer directly. "Have you been feeling unusually tired, cold spots in the apartment, electronics malfunctioning?" I nodded to all three. My laptop had been shutting down randomly despite being fully charged. The cold spot in my bedroom had become permanent, no matter how high I set the heating. And despite sleeping pills, I woke exhausted every morning as if I hadn't rested at all. "It's feeding," Vicente said, speaking for the first time. His voice was deep, authoritative. "Not just on the food you left, but on you now, on your energy." How is that possible? Despite the evidence before me, part of my mind still searched for rational explanations. "When you looked at it, when you acknowledged its existence, you created a connection," Doña Carmela explained. "Like recognizing someone across a crowded room. Once eye contact is made, a relationship begins, however small." "And I invited it in without the protection of photos or flowers," I finished, understanding dawning. "So now it thinks it has rights to me." "Not rights," Vicente clarified, "but a doorway. And it's hungry, Alejandro, very hungry." That night they helped me set up a proper altar in my apartment. We used a larger table covered with a vibrant cloth. Doña Carmela brought fresh marigolds, their pungent scent filling the room. I printed photos of my father and grandparents, placing them prominently in the center. And beside them I placed a small faded photograph I'd found in a historical archive, a group of anonymous revolutionary soldiers, their faces serious beneath wide-brimmed hats, rifles in hand. "For those whose names are lost," I said, as I placed it, feeling slightly foolish, but desperate enough to try anything. We lit candles, set out water pan de muerto and small dishes of food. Everything a proper altar should have. "Now what?" I asked when we finished. "Now we wait," Doña Carmela said. "And you must stay strong. Whatever happens, whatever you see or hear, remember it was human once. Treat it with respect, but don't show fear. Fear feeds it more than anything." They left reluctantly around midnight, making me promise to call if anything happened. I sat in my living room with every light blazing, facing the altar, waiting. The hours crawled by. 1 a.m., 2 a.m., nothing. At 3:00 a.m. precisely, the temperature plummeted. My breath clouded before me, and the candles on the altar flickered wildly despite there being no draft. The marigold petals trembled as if disturbed by invisible fingers. Then I heard it, that same wet, desperate feeding sound I'd heard the first night. But there was nothing visible at the altar. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I know you're here," I said, my voice shaking despite my best efforts. "I can hear you." The feeding sound stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. Then, slowly, a darkness began to gather at the far end of my living room. It was like watching ink disperse in water, but in reverse, coalescing, thickening, taking form. The shape was more defined this time, still hunched and twisted, but unmistakably humanoid. The skin hung in tatters, revealing glimpses of something underneath that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as if it had to remember how each joint worked before using it. It stood there swaying slightly, its head tilted at an angle that would have broken a human neck. Then it took one lurching step forward. I fought every instinct screaming at me to run. "I put out food for you," I managed to say, pointing to the altar. "And I found a picture. I don't know your name, but I remember you." The entity paused. Its head straightened slightly, and I could now see its face more clearly. The features were blurred, indistinct, like a photograph left out in the rain. But the eyes, those milky white orbs, were painfully clear, staring directly at me. It made a sound, then not the feeding noise, but something else. A dry, rattling whisper that might have been words once, long ago. "Can you understand me?" I asked, amazed that my voice still worked. The entity took another step forward, then another. It wasn't approaching the altar, but coming directly toward me. Each movement seemed to require enormous effort, as if it was forcing itself through thick mud. I scrambled backward until my back hit the wall. My heart hammered so violently I thought it might burst from my chest. The entity kept coming now, just a few feet away. The cold emanating from it was so intense my skin burned. "Please," I whispered, not knowing what else to say. "The altar is for you. I remember you." It stopped, head tilting again at that impossible angle. Those white eyes bored into mine, and I had the distinct impression it was searching for something in my face, recognition perhaps. Then, with a movement so fast I barely registered it, its arm shot out toward me. The hand, if it could be called that, with its too many joints and elongated fingers, reached for my face. I felt, rather than saw it, an overwhelming cold that stole my breath and made my skin tighten painfully. Just as its fingers were about to make contact, there was a loud crack from the altar. One of the candles had exploded, sending glass and hot wax across the table. The entity jerked back its form, momentarily destabilizing, becoming less solid. It turned toward the altar, seeming to notice it fully for the first time. It drifted closer, those white eyes fixed on the photographs. When it reached the small historical photo of the revolutionary soldiers, it became very still. A sound emerged from it, then a keening so high-pitched it made my ears ring. It reached toward the photograph with those distorted fingers hovering just above the surface without touching it. "Me recuerdas?" It whispered, its voice like paper tearing. "Do you remember me?" Before I could respond, a banging at my door shattered the moment. The entity's form dispersed instantly like smoke in a strong wind. The temperature began to normalize immediately. "Alejandro!" It was Doña Carmela's voice. "Are you all right? Open the door?" I stumbled to the door, my legs weak and trembling. Doña Carmela and Vicente stood there, both in nightclothes. "We heard a scream," Vicente said, pushing past me into the apartment, looking around warily. "Not me," I said, my voice hoarse. "It was it." I described what had happened, the entity's approach, the exploding candle, its reaction to the photograph. As I spoke, I noticed dark bruises forming on my forearms, where the cold had been most intense, perfect imprints of elongated fingers with too many joints. Doña Carmela examined the bruises, her expression grave. "It's growing stronger," she said. "It's feeding on your energy, your attention. We need help." The next day they took me to see Don Mateo, a curandero who lived in a nearby neighborhood. He was an elderly man with silver hair and a face weathered by years in the sun. His small home was filled with plants, candles, and religious icons from both Catholic and indigenous traditions. He listened to my story without interruption, nodding occasionally as if confirming details he already knew. When I showed him the bruises, which had darkened overnight to an almost black color, his eyes widened slightly. "You haven't just encountered a forgotten soul," he said when I finished. "You've opened a passage, not an altar, a doorway. Without the protective elements, without the specific invitation to your loved ones, you created an opening that any wandering spirit could use." And in a building with such history, with such pain embedded in its very walls, what came through was complicated. "What do you mean complicated?" I asked. "When someone dies traumatically, violently, with no name, no burial rites, no one to remember them, after enough time they begin to lose themselves. First their name, then their face, then their humanity itself. What remains is hunger, confusion, and pain." Don Mateo leaned forward, his eyes intense. "What you describe, the way it moves, its appearance, its desperation, this is a soul that has been forgotten for so long it has forgotten itself." "Can it be helped?" I asked, surprising myself with the question. Despite my terror, I felt a strange pity for whatever this entity had once been. Perhaps, he said, but it will be difficult. It has attached itself to you now. It recognized in you someone who acknowledged it, who saw it. After decades, perhaps a century of invisibility, that connection is powerful. He gave me a small black stone, instructing me to keep it with me at all times. This will help ground you, protect your energy, he explained. He also provided specific herbs to burn, prayers to recite, and instructions for strengthening the altar. But most importantly, he said as I was leaving, you must learn about them. The soldiers who died there. Make them real in your mind. They were people once sons, brothers, fathers. If you can remember them as people, not just as a frightening entity, you may help this lost soul remember itself. I spent the next week researching obsessively. I visited historical archives, read accounts of the revolutionary battles in Mexico City, studied old maps that showed how the neighborhood had changed. I discovered that in November 1913, a particularly brutal battle had left dozens of revolutionary soldiers wounded. Many were brought to makeshift hospitals throughout the city, including a commandeered home that matched the location of my building. Hospital records were incomplete, but one journal kept by a field nurse mentioned 23 souls lost in the East Ward during a 3-day period. Many had arrived without identification, delirious with fever or unconscious from their wounds. With the fighting intensifying, proper burial had been impossible. The journal mentioned a temporary resting place in the building's cellar. Armed with this knowledge, I returned to my apartment with a new sense of purpose. I enhanced the altar, adding more historical context, a small revolutionary flag, a vintage bullet casing I'd found in an antique shop, a copy of the nurse's journal entry. I placed a glass of water at the center, remembering how many of the soldiers had died of fever, perhaps thirsty until the end. That night I waited again, but this time, instead of fear, I tried to focus on respect. These were young men who had died fighting for what they believed in, far from home, their names and faces lost to history. Whatever this entity had become, it had once been human. It deserved dignity. At 3 a.m., the familiar cold descended. But it was different this time, less aggressive, more localized near the altar. The candles dimmed but didn't go out. The marigold petals trembled. The darkness gathered again, taking that now familiar, hunched shape. But something had changed. The form was more defined, less chaotic. It still moved with that unnatural, jerky gait, but there seemed to be more purpose to its movements. It approached the altar directly this time, ignoring me entirely. It stood before the photographs, its head tilted in that unsettling way. Its arm extended toward the historical photo fingers hovering just above the surface. "Recuerdam," it whispered. But the voice was clearer now, less like tearing paper and more like a human voice strained through gravel. "I remember you," I said quietly. "You died here. You were a soldier." The entity became very still. Then slowly it turned to face me. The change in its appearance made my breath catch. The face was still blurred, features indistinct, but there was more definition now. The eyes were still milky white, but I could make out the suggestion of a pupil, a hint of direction in its gaze. "You fought bravely," I continued, recalling details from my research. "You were brought here wounded. This house was a hospital then. Many died here without names, without proper burials. But you were not forgotten. I remember you now." The entity took a single step toward me. I fought the urge to back away, remembering Don Mateo's words about showing respect rather than fear. It reached out again, but this time the movement was slower, less threatening. Those elongated fingers stopped inches from my face. "Gracias." It whispered the word barely recognizable but unmistakably Spanish. Then, to my amazement, the form began to change. The hunched posture straightened slightly. The skin, while still damaged, seemed less like rotting flesh and more like tattered clothing. For just a moment, so briefly I might have imagined it, I saw the suggestion of a uniform, a young man's face ravaged by fever but recognizably human. The vision faded quickly, the entity returning to its more amorphous state. But something fundamental had shifted. There was a sense of awareness now, of consciousness beyond mere hunger. It drifted back to the altar, hovering before the offerings. The feeding sounds began again, but they were different, less desperate, more measured. When it finished, it turned once more to look at me, then slowly faded from view. Not the violent dispersion from before, but a gradual diminishing like mist in morning sun. The apartment felt different after it left, still cold, but not painfully so. The oppressive weight that had hung in the air for weeks seemed lighter somehow. I slept that night for the first time in days, dreamless and deep. The next morning I woke to find the water glass on the altar empty, though no one had touched it. The marigold petals were arranged differently, forming a rough circle around the historical photograph. And on the mirror in my bathroom, visible only because of the condensation from my shower, were two words written by an invisible finger, "Me recordeste." You remembered me. That message on my bathroom mirror marked a turning point. Whatever entity I had encountered was changing, becoming more defined, more conscious, perhaps even remembering what it once was. The bruises on my forearms had begun to fade, transforming from black to deep purple, then to a sickly yellow-green. But while the physical marks diminished, my obsession only grew stronger. I needed to understand exactly what had happened in this building. Not just the vague historical outlines, but the specific details, names, if possible, faces, stories. If I could help one forgotten soul remember itself, could I do the same for others? Were there more entities like this one lingering in the spaces between walls, waiting for someone to acknowledge their existence? My work suffered as I spent days in historical archives and libraries. My supervisor sent concerned messages about missed deadlines, but I barely registered them. Nothing seemed as important as piecing together the forgotten history beneath my feet. Eventually, I found what I was looking for, a faded, water-damaged ledger from the field hospital preserved in the National Archives. Most of the names were illegible, but there were descriptions: male, approximately 20 years, gunshot wound to abdomen; young soldier, severe burns, no identification; fever patient, delirious, no known regiment. Page after page documented lives that had ended in pain and anonymity. On one particularly grim page, a nurse had written, November 2nd, 1913. Lost 7 more today. No space in the cemetery, fighting in the streets. The bodies were placed below as temporary measure. November 2nd, Day of the Dead, exactly 107 years before my encounter. I photographed everything, bringing the images back to my apartment. That night I enhanced my altar again, adding printouts from the ledger. I included small objects that might have meaning to soldiers from that era. A replica Revolutionary coin tobacco leaves a small flask of tequila. I wasn't sure if these would help, but they felt right. As I worked, I became aware of a persistent cold spot that seemed to follow me around the apartment. Not the aggressive, painful cold from before, but a gentle coolness, like standing near an open window on a spring morning. It felt attentive. "I know you're here," I said aloud, my voice steady. "I'm trying to help you remember." No response came, but the cold intensified slightly, as if in acknowledgement. That night I fell asleep more easily than I had in weeks. My dreams were vivid but not frightening flashes of a dusty courtyard filled with wounded men, the sound of distant gunfire voices calling in Spanish too rapid for me to understand. I saw glimpses of faces, young men with serious eyes and determined expressions. None were clear enough to identify, but they felt real in a way dreams usually don't. I woke at exactly 3:00 a.m., not to terror, but to a strange sense of expectation. My bedroom was cold, and I immediately knew I wasn't alone. The entity stood at the foot of my bed. Its form was dramatically different now, still not fully human, but no longer the twisted, decaying thing I had first encountered. It had height and substance, the suggestion of a military uniform, and a face that, while still blurred, showed distinct features: eyes, nose, mouth. The eyes were no longer completely white. There were irises now dark against pale sclera. He didn't speak, but I felt a question emanating from him, a wordless inquiry. "I found records," I said, sitting up slowly, "from the hospital that was here. Many soldiers died in this building during the Revolution. They were buried in the basement because the fighting made it too dangerous to take them to cemeteries." The figure remained still, watching me. "I think you were one of them," I continued. "You died here unnamed and were buried below, and on DíaDeLosMuertos, when I set up an incomplete altar, I accidentally invited you in." He moved then, a slight nod that was almost human. "Would you like to see what I found?" I asked, surprising myself with the question. Was I really inviting a supernatural entity to look at historical documents with me? Another nod, more definite this time. Slowly I got out of bed, maintaining a respectful distance as I led him to the living room where my altar and research materials were spread out. He moved differently now, still with that strange, dragging gait, but more coordinated, more intentional. I spread out the ledger photographs on the table beside the altar, pointing to entries that might be relevant. "These are records from when this building was a hospital. Many soldiers were brought here, many died. Most weren't identified." He leaned over the images, those semi-translucent fingers hovering above the pages. I noticed they seemed more defined now, still elongated, still with too many joints, but closer to human hands than before. As he studied the documents, the air around us grew colder, and I began to see my breath misting before me. The entity's form flickered and distorted, as if strong emotion was making it difficult for him to maintain cohesion. "Mi nombre," he whispered, the voice clearer than before, though still like stones grinding together. My name, my heart sank. "I don't know your name," I admitted. "Most soldiers weren't recorded by name, especially if they arrived unconscious or too wounded to speak." The entity's form destabilized further, the edges blurring, the suggestion of the uniform fading. For a moment I feared he would revert to the horrific shape I had first seen. "But I know you fought for something you believed in," I added quickly. "You were part of something important. The revolution changed Mexico forever. What you fought for mattered even if your name was lost." He steadied somewhat, but the disappointment was palpable, hanging in the air like the scent of rain before a storm. "Wait," I said, struck by an idea. "There might be a way to learn more." The next morning I approached Doña Carmela with a bold request: access to the building's basement. "Absolutely not," she replied firmly. "It's been sealed for decades. Parts of the floor are unstable, there's probably black mold, maybe even structural damage." "Please," I insisted. "I need to see where they were buried. I found evidence that revolutionary soldiers are interred down there. It's part of our national history." She shook her head. "It's too dangerous, Alejandro. Besides, if there are remains down there, disturbing them could make your situation worse, not better." I showed her the bruises on my arms, now fading. "It's already getting better. I'm helping him remember who he was, but I need to see where he was laid to rest." She studied my face, her expression softening slightly. "You've changed," she observed. "A few weeks ago you were terrified, trying to banish this entity. Now you speak of helping him." "Because I understand better now," I explained. "He's not malevolent, he's lost. Forgotten for so long he forgot himself. I think I can help him find peace." After much persuasion, Doña Carmela reluctantly agreed to let me see the basement, but only with her husband Vicente accompanying me. The entrance was a heavy wooden door beneath the main staircase, secured with both an old padlock and a newer deadbolt. "No one has been down there in at least 15 years, she said, as Vicente worked on the locks. The last owner had it inspected, decided repairs would be too costly, and simply sealed it up. The door finally opened with a groan of protesting hinges. A rush of stale, cold air hit us, carrying the scents of damp earth mildew and something else, an old, musty smell that reminded me of library archives. The stone steps leading down were worn in the center, testifying to decades of use before the basement was abandoned. Vicente went first, the beam of his powerful flashlight, cutting through darkness so complete it seemed to have physical weight. I followed close behind my own smaller light, barely making an impression on the gloom. The basement was larger than I had imagined, extending beneath the entire building. Stone pillars supported the low ceiling, and the floor was packed earth in some places, cracked concrete in others. The space was divided into several rooms by crumbling brick walls. Abandoned furniture, broken appliances, and stacks of moldering boxes lined the walls, decades of discarded possessions from former tenants. Where would they have buried them? I asked, my voice sounding muffled in the thick air. Vicente shook his head. If I had to guess, somewhere with soft earth away from the main support structures. We moved deeper into the basement, stepping carefully around debris. In the furthest room, the flashlight beams revealed a section of floor that was different from the rest, just packed earth free of concrete, in a roughly rectangular area, about 15 feet long and 10 feet wide. There, Vicente said quietly, pointing. That would be the logical place. As we approached the area, the temperature dropped dramatically. Our breath clouded before us, and the flashlight beams dimmed as if struggling against the darkness. A pressure built in my ears like descending rapidly in an airplane. "We should leave," Vicente whispered, crossing himself. "This is not a place for the living." But I felt compelled to move closer. I knelt beside the earthen patch, laying my hand gently on the ground. It was ice-cold and slightly yielding beneath my fingers, unlike the hard-packed dirt in the rest of the basement. "They're here," I said, certainty filling me. "This is where they were buried." As the words left my mouth, the air around us changed. The pressure increased until my ears popped painfully. The darkness seemed to thicken, coalescing into vague, shifting forms at the edges of our flashlight beams. The cold became so intense it burned my lungs with each breath. Vicente grabbed my arm. "We go now!" This time I didn't resist. We backed away slowly, maintaining respectful silence, our lights trained on the path back to the stairs. The oppressive atmosphere followed us like a tide of cold air pushing at our backs. Just as we reached the stairs, my flashlight caught something on the wall I hadn't noticed on our way, in a small wooden cross, weathered and faded, nailed to one of the stone pillars. Beneath it, barely visible, someone had scratched a date into the stone: November 2nd, 1913. Day of the Dead, the day 7 unnamed soldiers had died, according to the ledger. When we emerged from the basement, I was shaking uncontrollably, though not entirely from fear. There was a strange exhilaration mixed with the terror, the certainty that I had stood in the presence of something profound, a forgotten piece of history made tangible. Doña Carmela took one look at our pale faces and immediately prepared hot chocolate with cinnamon. As the warmth returned to my body, I described what we had felt in the basement. "They're restless," she said softly. "Disturbed by your interest, perhaps, or by the connection you formed with one of them." "Not disturbed," I corrected. "Awakened. They've been forgotten for so long, and now someone remembers." That night I added the final pieces to my altar: a small vial of earth I had secretly taken from the basement, and a hand-drawn sketch of the wooden cross we had found. I lit fresh candles, laid out new offerings, and waited. The entity appeared earlier than usual, at midnight rather than 3 a.m. His form was the most defined I had seen, yet clearly a young man in a revolutionary uniform, though the details remained blurred like a photograph taken during movement. His face was still indistinct, but I could make out dark eyes, a suggestion of a mustache, high cheekbones. "I found where you were buried," I told him. "In the basement with others. There's a cross marking the spot, dated November 2nd, 1913. He moved closer, and for the first time I didn't feel threatened by his proximity. The cold that accompanied him was still present, but bearable now, like stepping into an air-conditioned room on a hot day. "Noviembre," he said, the word rough but recognizable. "DíaDeLosMuertos." "Yes," I confirmed. "You died on Day of the Dead over 100 years ago." He seemed to consider this, his form flickering slightly. Then he gestured toward the altar, specifically to the ledger photographs. "You want to know if your name is there?" I asked. He nodded, the movement almost human. I spread out the pages again, pointing to entries from early November 1913. "These might be you or your comrades. Most entries don't have names, just descriptions." His fingers hovered over one particular entry. "Soldier, young gunshot wound to chest, arrived unconscious. Died of fever November 2nd. No identification." Something about this specific entry seemed to resonate with him. His form became more solid, more defined as he studied it. "Is this you?" I asked. He didn't respond directly, but his hand moved to his chest, fingers splaying over the area where a gunshot wound would have been. The gesture was so human, so full of remembered pain, that my throat tightened with unexpected emotion. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "I'm sorry you died that way far from home without anyone knowing your name." He looked at me, then really looked at me with eyes that were now clearly brown set in a young face that, while still indistinct, showed the outlines of individual features. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but instead of words, a sound emerged that raised the hair on my arms, a high, keening wail that somehow conveyed decades of loneliness, confusion, and loss. The sound reverberated through my apartment, making the windows vibrate in their frames. Objects on shelves began to tremble and fall. The candles on the altar flared impossibly high, then guttered out all at once, plunging the room into darkness. In the sudden black, I felt, rather than saw, his presence intensify. The cold became a physical pressure against my skin. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, could barely breathe. It wasn't an attack, it was an immersion. I was being shown something. Images flooded my mind: a dusty village square, a young man enlisting proud in his new uniform, the chaos of battle, the searing pain of a bullet, waking in agony in a makeshift hospital, the world blurred by fever, voices speaking rapidly, hands trying to cool a burning forehead, and finally darkness followed by an eternity of confusion, hunger, and solitude. These weren't just visions, they carried emotional weight, sensations, even smells and tastes. I was experiencing his memories, his death, and the long, lonely aftermath. When the flood of images finally ceased, I found myself on my knees in the dark, tears streaming down my face. Gradually, I became aware that I wasn't alone in my emotional response. Quiet, sobbing sounds came from the presence before me. "Miguel," I whispered the name, coming to me from nowhere, or perhaps from the memories themselves. "Your name was Miguel." The sobbing stopped abruptly. The temperature in the room normalized so suddenly it felt like a physical shock. A single candle on the altar reignited itself, casting a warm glow that revealed the entity Miguel standing before me. He was almost completely human now, a young man of perhaps 20 in the tattered uniform of a revolutionary soldier. His face, while still somewhat transparent, showed clear features, expressive eyes, high cheekbones, a thin mustache. A dark stain spread across his chest where the bullet had entered. "Miguel," he repeated, touching his own chest. His voice was still rough, but unmistakably human. "Mi nombre es Miguel." "I remember you, Miguel," I said, rising to my feet. "I will remember you." He nodded, a smile transforming his face. For a moment, just a moment, he looked entirely solid, entirely real, as if he had never died at all. Then he began to fade, not in the violent dispersion of before, but gently, like mist in morning sunlight. Before he disappeared completely, he reached out one hand toward me. Without hesitation, I extended my own. Our fingers didn't quite meet, couldn't meet, but I felt a whisper of sensation like the gentlest breeze against my skin. "Gracias." He said the word clear and strong. Then he was gone. I stood in my living room alone, but somehow not lonely, trying to process what had happened. I had learned his name, Miguel, but it wasn't from historical records. It had come from some connection between us, some transference of memory or identity I couldn't explain. I slept deeply that night without dreams or disturbances. When I woke, the apartment felt different, lighter, as if a weight I'd grown accustomed to had been lifted. The altar looked undisturbed except for one detail. The photograph of revolutionary soldiers had shifted slightly, and a single marigold petal lay across the image of a young soldier in the back row. I was certain I hadn't placed it there. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in my apartment continued to improve. The persistent cold spots vanished. My electronics functioned normally. The bruises on my arms faded completely. I began to think that perhaps Miguel had found peace, that our strange connection had somehow helped him remember himself and move on. But if I thought that was the end of the story, I was mistaken. A week after our final encounter, I was awakened at 3 a.m. by my phone ringing Doña Carmela, her voice urgent. "Alejandro, you need to come downstairs. Now!" I found her in the building's lobby with Vicente and several strangers in suits, despite the early hour. One introduced himself as a representative from the National Institute of Anthropology and History. Construction workers were beginning preliminary assessments for renovations, he explained. When they entered the basement, they discovered something significant. "The burial site," I said, not a question. He nodded, looking surprised at my knowledge. "Yes. What appears to be a mass grave dating from the Revolutionary period. We've halted all construction and brought in experts. Over the following days, a team of archaeologists and historians carefully excavated the site in the basement. They recovered the remains of 23 individuals, all male, all showing evidence consistent with battle wounds or disease. Many had bullets still lodged in their bones. Personal effects were scarce: a few buttons, the remnants of uniforms, a couple of corroded medallions, and one small tarnished silver identification tag with a partially legible name, M. Herrera, Miguel. The historian in charge of the excavation was fascinated by the coincidence between the date scratched on the pillar, November 2nd, 1913, and my experiences during DíaDeLosMuertos. "The Day of the Dead creates a thinning of the veil between worlds according to tradition," she explained. "If any time would allow for such a connection between past and present, it would be then." The remains were carefully documented, studied, and eventually prepared for proper burial with full military honors. The ceremony would take place in the National Cemetery, with plaques acknowledging the soldiers' contributions to the revolution, even though most would remain unnamed, except for Miguel Herrera, whose identity had been restored after more than a century. The night before the reburial ceremony, I sensed a presence in my apartment again. Not the oppressive, frightening force from before, but something gentler, more diffuse, like remembering a song rather than hearing it. I went to the small altar I still maintained and lit a fresh candle. "Is that you, Miguel?" I asked softly. No apparition formed. No dramatic temperature drop occurred, but the candle flame bent slightly as if in a gentle breeze where no breeze should be. "They found your name," I told the empty air. "They're giving you and the others a proper burial tomorrow with honors." The flame flickered more strongly, dancing high for a moment, then settling. "I'll be there," I promised. "I'll remember you, Miguel Herrera. You won't be forgotten again." The candle burned steadily after that, but I had the distinct impression I was no longer alone. Not just Miguel, but others' presences at the edges of perception, watching, listening. The forgotten soldiers perhaps waiting for their final rest. That night I dreamed of a young Miguel Herrera, whole and healthy in a crisp uniform. He stood at attention with his comrades, 22 other young men, their faces clear and distinct. One by one they saluted me, then turned and walked into a bright light that obscured their features but couldn't hide their smiles. The reburial ceremony the next day was solemn and moving. Government officials, military representatives, and historians gathered to honor the forgotten revolutionary soldiers. I stood at the back, watching as 23 small coffins were laid to rest with full military honors, including a rifle salute that echoed across the cemetery. Each coffin bore a plaque. 22 read, "Unknown Soldier of the Mexican Revolution." The 23rd bore the name Miguel Herrera. As the ceremony concluded, a sudden breeze swept through the cemetery, carrying marigold petals from the funeral displays into a brief swirling dance above the fresh graves. Then just as quickly the wind died and the petals settled gently on the newly turned earth. I felt it then, a release, a lightening, as if something that had been tense for a very long time had finally relaxed. Whatever connection had formed between Miguel and me, between the past and the present, was gently dissolving like a knot, untying itself. That evening I returned to my apartment and stood before my altar. The historical photograph of revolutionary soldiers seemed different somehow, though I couldn't articulate exactly how. When I looked closely at the blurry image of young men in the back row, I thought one face seemed clearer than before, a young man with high cheekbones and a thin mustache, his expression solemn but eyes bright with purpose. "Descansa en paz, Miguel Herrera," I said softly, lighting a candle. "Rest in peace." As the flame caught and steadied, I could have sworn I heard a distant voice reply, "Gracias por recordarme." Thank you for remembering me. I maintained the small altar in the weeks that followed, but my apartment remained peaceful. The oppressive atmosphere never returned, nor did the cold spots or strange sounds. The only lingering effect of my supernatural encounter was my changed perspective. I could no longer view the world through the purely rational lens I had once favored. I knew now that some connections transcend time, and understanding that remembrance has power, and that names once lost can be found again. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known then, was that my journey with the forgotten dead was far from over. I had helped one lost soul remember itself, but there were others, many others, still waiting in the shadows between worlds. And 1 month later, I would discover that opening such doors can have consequences that extend far beyond a single haunting, a single apartment, or a single forgotten name. After the reburial ceremony, life gradually returned to normal, or what passes for normal when you've helped a century-old ghost remember its name. The bruises on my arms healed completely. My sleep became peaceful again. My work performance improved as I redirected my obsessive energy back to coding and systems architecture. I even started dating someone, Lucia, a historian I'd met during my research into the revolution. I kept the altar in place, smaller now, but maintained with respect. Each morning I would light a fresh candle and say Miguel's name aloud, fulfilling my promise that he would not be forgotten again. It became a comforting ritual, a reminder of the extraordinary experience we had shared. 1 month after the reburial, I invited Lucia to my apartment for dinner. As she examined my bookshelf, she paused at the framed photograph I now kept there, the image of revolutionary soldiers with Miguel's face subtly clearer than the others. "Where did you get this?" she asked, studying it with professional interest. "The National Archives," I replied. "It's from around 1913. She frowned, leaning closer. "That's strange. What is this soldier here?" She pointed to Miguel's image. "There's something unusual about how clear his face is compared to the others." I smiled, pleased that someone else could see the difference. "That's Miguel Herrera. He was one of the soldiers they found in our basement." Lucia gave me an odd look. "How do you know which one he is? The identification tag they found had no photo?" "No," I said, unwilling to explain the full truth. She seemed about to press further when a sudden chill swept through the apartment. The lights flickered briefly, then stabilized. We both glanced around, startled. "Electrical problems?" she asked. "Must be," I agreed, though I felt a familiar prickle at the back of my neck, the sensation of being watched. The evening continued pleasantly enough, though twice more the temperature dropped noticeably. Lucia pulled her sweater tighter, commenting on the apartment's poor insulation. I nodded agreement, but internally I was growing concerned. These cold spots felt different from Miguel's presence, more diffuse, less focused, as if coming from multiple sources simultaneously. After Lucia left, I stood before the altar and lit a fresh candle. "Miguel," I called softly, "is that you?" No response came, no flickering flame, no gentle pressure change. Whatever I had felt earlier, it wasn't Miguel. That night I dreamed of the basement again. In the dream I stood before the now empty gravesite. watching as the earth began to ripple and shift like water disturbed by something moving beneath the surface. 22 indistinct forms rose from the ground, not Miguel, but the others, the unnamed soldiers whose remains had been moved to the national cemetery. They surrounded me, these shadowy figures, their features blurred and shifting. Unlike Miguel, they hadn't remembered themselves. They were still lost, formless, trapped between what they had been and what they had become. They reached for me with elongated, jointed fingers, not threatening but beseeching. Recuerdanos, they whispered in unison, their voices like leaves rustling. Remember us. I woke drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The apartment was freezing, my breath visible in the pre-dawn light. Every surface was covered in a thin layer of frost, as if the temperature had plummeted to impossible levels while I slept. On my bathroom mirror, written in the condensation, were 2 words, Ayúdanos también, help us too. I knew then what had happened. By helping Miguel remember himself, by restoring his name and identity, I had awakened the others, the 22 unnamed soldiers who had been buried alongside him. They had witnessed one of their comrades find peace, find remembrance, while they remained forgotten, nameless. Now they wanted the same. Over the next week, the phenomena intensified. Cold spots moved through my apartment like invisible currents. Objects would be slightly displaced when I returned home. Nothing dramatic, just a book moved an inch, a cup turned to a different angle. My electronics malfunctioned constantly, batteries draining in minutes, screens displaying random pixels before going dark. Each night I dreamed of them, 22 forgotten soldiers, their features indistinct, but their yearning palpable. Each morning I would find new frost patterns on my windows, new messages in the condensation on mirrors and glass surfaces. Danos nombres, give us names. No queremos ser olvidados. We don't want to be forgotten. Ayúdanos a recordar. Help us remember. I contacted the historian who had overseen the excavation, asking if there was any way to identify the other soldiers. She explained gently that without identification tags or detailed records, it was virtually impossible. The revolutionary forces had been notoriously poor at maintaining personnel files, and many recruits had been illiterate farmers who left no written records behind. I understand your interest, Mr. Reyes, she said, but sometimes history keeps its secrets. Not every soldier's name can be recovered. That's why we honor the unknown soldiers, because while we can't name them individually, we can still acknowledge their sacrifice. Her words made sense logically, but they provided no solution to my increasingly desperate situation. The entities in my apartment were growing more restless, more demanding. The cold spots had become painful again, like Miguel's presence had been in the beginning. I would wake with fresh bruises on my arms and legs as if I'd been grabbed by invisible hands while I slept. I knew I needed to do something, but what I couldn't give them names they had lost a century ago. I couldn't fabricate identities for them. They wanted to be remembered as themselves, not as inventions of my imagination. In desperation, I went to see Don Mateo again. The elderly curandero listened to my story with a grave expression. "You've opened a door that cannot be easily closed," he said when I finished. "By helping one spirit, you've given hope to others. But without names, without identities, they cannot fully remember themselves." "What can I do?" I asked. "I can't give them what doesn't exist anymore." Don Mateo was quiet for a long time, his weathered hands moving prayer beads rhythmically. Finally he spoke. "Perhaps they don't need their original names. Perhaps what they truly need is to be known, to be seen as individuals rather than a faceless mass. You gave Miguel that gift. You saw him as a person, not just as a haunting. How do I see those who have no faces to see?" I asked. "Look deeper," he replied. "They may have lost their names, but perhaps some essence of who they were remains. Find that, acknowledge it, and you may help them find peace." That night I expanded my altar significantly. I gathered 22 candles, in addition to Miguel's arranging them in a semicircle. I placed the historical photograph prominently, focusing on the blurry faces of the other soldiers. I added small objects that might resonate with men of that era, and station a farmer's hat representing their likely backgrounds, a small toy horse symbolizing the rural lives many had left behind, a replica of a revolutionary flag acknowledging their cause. I lit each candle individually, concentrating on the indistinct faces in the photograph. "I may not know your names," I said aloud, "but I see you. I acknowledge you. I remember you." The air in the apartment grew cold immediately, but it was different this time, expectant rather than threatening. The candle flames remained steady despite the temperature drop, burning with unusual brightness. I continued, speaking to each candle as if it represented one of the forgotten soldiers. "You fought for what you believed in. You died far from home, but not without purpose. Your sacrifice helped shape Mexico's future. You are not forgotten." As I spoke, I felt rather than saw them gathering around me, 22 presences still formless but somehow more defined than before. The cold intensified until my teeth chattered, but I kept speaking, addressing each presence in turn, acknowledging their existence, their sacrifice, their individuality, even without names. Hours passed this way. My voice grew hoarse, my body numb with cold, but I persisted. Sometime around dawn, I felt a shift in the atmosphere, a releasing of tension, like the moment a knot finally comes untied. The cold began to recede, not completely, but substantially. When I finally looked up exhausted, I saw that the photograph on my altar had changed. The faces of the soldiers were still blurry, still unidentifiable to anyone else. But to my eyes they had acquired definition, not specific features, but a sense of individuality, of personhood. They were no longer just smudges on old paper. They were people who had lived, fought, suffered, and died. I slept deeply that day, missing work without regret. When I woke in the evening, the apartment felt different, not empty, but settled like a house after guests have left. The cold spots remained, but were gentler now, almost companionable. That night I dreamed not of desperate, formless entities, but of 22 young men in revolutionary uniforms standing at attention. Their faces remained indistinct, but each had a presence, a bearing that distinguished him from the others. One by one they saluted me, then turned away, walking toward a bright light in the distance. In the morning I found my altar transformed. The 22 candles had burned completely down, leaving perfect circles of wax. The photograph appeared unchanged to the casual observer, but I could now distinguish each soldier as an individual, even without clear features or names. On my bathroom mirror, written in condensation that shouldn't have been possible in the now warm apartment, were the words, "Gracias por vernos." Thank you for seeing us. I thought it was over then. I believed I had helped them find peace, just as I had helped Miguel. For several weeks my apartment remained calm. The cold spots faded. My electronics functioned normally. My sleep was undisturbed by dreams or visitations. But last night, everything changed. I was preparing for bed when I noticed my reflection in the bathroom mirror looked wrong. Not drastically, but subtly, as if my features were slightly out of alignment with my face. When I raised my hand to touch my cheek, my reflection moved a fraction of a second too late. As I stared horrified, my reflection's eyes changed, the irises fading to white, pupilless orbs that stared back at me with hungry intensity. My reflection smiled, though I was not smiling. Its mouth opened, and I heard a whisper that seemed to come from inside my own head. "You helped them remember. Now you must help us." The image in the mirror flickered, and for just a moment I saw not my face, but dozens of faces superimposed over one another, all with those same milky white eyes, all reaching toward the glass as if trying to break through. I stumbled backward away from the mirror, my heart pounding. The bathroom light flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. In the blackness I heard whispers, not 23 voices now, but hundreds, thousands speaking in languages I didn't recognize, all asking the same thing, "Recuérdanos." When I finally found the courage to turn the lights back on, the mirror showed only my normal reflection, pale and terrified. But as I looked closer, I noticed something on my face that hadn't been there before, a small, dark bruise on my cheek in the exact shape of a fingerprint. This morning I researched the history of this neighborhood more deeply. What I found chilled me to the bone. This building wasn't the only makeshift hospital during the Revolution. The entire district had been a medical zone with dozens of commandeered buildings housing thousands of wounded. And not just from the Revolution. Over centuries, this area had seen multiple conflicts, epidemics, natural disasters. Beneath these streets lie countless unnamed dead, forgotten by history, their individual identities lost to time. I helped 23 soldiers remember who they were. But in doing so, I've awakened something far larger, the collective hunger of all the forgotten dead who lie beneath this city, all those who yearn to be remembered, to be named, to be seen. I write this now as a warning. The altar method works, I've proven that. But be careful what doors you open, what invitations you extend. Because once you've acknowledged one forgotten soul, others will come seeking the same recognition. And there are so many of them waiting in the spaces between memory and oblivion, hoping for someone to finally see them. Tonight is Dia de los Muertos once again. My apartment has grown cold despite the heating running at maximum. The mirrors in my home show strange reflections when viewed from the corner of my eye. And on my computer screen words appear unbidden. Recuérdanos a todos. Remember all of us. I don't know if I can help them all. I don't know if anyone could. But I know I can't stop trying because I've seen what lies on the other side of forgetting, the terrible hunger, the loss of self, the endless aching loneliness. So I will light my candles, I will speak to the darkness, I will acknowledge as many as I can, knowing it will never be enough. And if you find yourself setting up an altar, this Dia de los Muertos, make sure you include photographs. Make sure you name those you wish to honor. Be specific in your invitations, because in the space between remembrance and forgetting, there are countless unnamed souls waiting for an open door. And once invited in, they may never leave. As I finish writing this, I feel a cold pressure on my shoulder like a hand seeking attention. In the reflection of my computer screen, I see not my face, but a pair of milky white eyes staring back at me. And behind them, countless others waiting their turn to be remembered.